It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't clever, and it definitely didn't pay well. Being a hired killer in the Middle Ages meant long hours in cold alleys, waiting for the right face to pass by. It meant mud, suspicion, and always watching your own back. No gadgets, no disguises, just a knife, a name, and a vague hope you'd survive long enough to collect your coin. Tonight, we're stepping into that quiet, dangerous world, a place of shadows and whispers, of crooked nobles and silent payments tucked in gloved hands. We'll follow the path of the people who made killing their trade, and why most of them ended up forgotten, hunted, or worse. So settle in. Let the torches burn low and the streets clear out. And before we begin, if you enjoy these slow journeys into the stranger corners of history, tap the like button, subscribe, and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see where our stories are drifting to. A knife beneath the cloak. It always began with a whisper, not the kind spoken in trust between friends, but the kind that floated behind closed shutters, half heard in a smoky tavern, or murmured in the shadowed corners of a cathedral cloister. There were no announcements, no letters sealed with wax, just a name, passed from lips to lips, like a small, dark prayer. And somewhere, eventually, that name would reach the ears of someone who made things disappear. Not a knight, not a soldier, someone else. You wouldn't know him in daylight. You might pass him on the muddy street beside the farrier's shop, or nod politely as he bought apples in the marketplace with coins that smelled faintly of blood. You wouldn't see the knife beneath his cloak. It lay flat, like a sleeping viper, pressed close against his spine, quiet, still, but never far from waking. He didn't wear black. That was just a story. He wore whatever let him blend in, a frayed linen tunic, sometimes a bit of wine-stained wool. He wasn't mysterious. He was forgettable, and that was the point. Because in the cities and castles of medieval Europe, the ones who lived in shadow didn't dress like shadows. They dressed like the man no one remembered seeing, the man who carried no banner, the man who left no footprint. His work began long before the blade was drawn. It started with weeks, sometimes months of waiting, watching, learning how a mark moved, when they left the bathhouse, who they trusted to carry messages, where they paused to look at church bells or flirt with a flower seller. These tiny moments were his guide. They were how he found the 1 hour, maybe only one, when the walls were weakest. He had no code, no oath, only survival. The guilds, when they existed, didn't offer protection. Some towns had no guilds at all, just loose bands of rogues who shared tips, wine, and the occasional grave. There were no pensions, no burials. You either died in silence or vanished into rumor. He remembered the first time, the way the blade felt, not in his hand, but in his chest, right behind the ribs, where guilt likes to hide. It passed, not because he grew numb, but because hunger didn't allow space for questions. People thought the job paid well. They were wrong. Most of the time, it barely paid at all. A handful of silver coins, maybe a ring if the target was noble, though selling it was always risky. What he earned was rarely enough for a hot meal and clean boots, but sometimes it was enough to survive one more winter. Sometimes, and even when he didn't kill, when the job was only to threaten, or deliver a note no one else dared carry, it left something behind, a stain, a quiet toll. As he sat by the fire at night, carving a splinter from the sole of his boot, he would wonder how many people now lived with fear because of him. How many moved through their days, glancing over their shoulders, waiting for someone just like him to step out of the fog. There were no songs for men like this, no stories carved into oak beams or sung over mugs of ale, only ghosts. Still, every now and then, in the dark before dawn, he would reach behind his back and feel the worn handle of the knife beneath his cloak, just to be sure it was still there, just to remind himself who he was, not because he loved the blade, but because he no longer knew how to live without it. Not all assassins were chosen. No child dreams of growing up to be an assassin. Not really. They might dream of swords and heroism, of grand victories and noble deeds sung by wandering minstrels. But no child, hunched over a bowl of barley stew in a smoke-filled hovel, ever whispers, "I want to be the one who ends a life in silence." And yet some found themselves there, not by desire, but by survival. It didn't start with a blade. It started with hunger, with winters that lasted too long, with mothers who died of fever and fathers who never came home from the levee, with brothers who vanished into warbands or mines. The street became home, or a monastery, or a caravan, and in the cracks of society, there were always those watching. A merchant with too many enemies, A lord who needed a message carried quietly, a priest with sins he wanted erased. They saw the quiet ones, the ones who didn't flinch, the ones who could steal bread without getting caught. A task was offered, not spoken plainly. Never. It came in suggestion, in half-said things. I hear you're quick. You don't mind getting your hands dirty, do you? There's a coin in it, and you look like you could use a warm meal. And before they understood what it was, they were in. A message one day, a silence enforced the next. At first it was only threats, a brick through a window, a whispered name, a blade drawn, but not used, just shown. But the day always came when that wasn't enough, when coin demanded more, and by then they had nowhere else to go. Some came from orphanages, where the nuns were cruel and the walls colder than the night. Others were servants who had seen too much, or runaways from failed apprenticeships. Some had once been soldiers, cast out, wounded, or left behind. They didn't seek the profession. It found them in the spaces no one else cared to look, and sometimes the training wasn't formal. There were no cloaks, no creeds, just whispered advice from an older man with scars across his palms, or a woman with a crooked smile who could vanish in a crowd of 5. They taught with stories, with warning, with one rule above all: trust no one, not even the one who taught you, because in this line of work, no alliances lasted forever. Coin changed hands, promises broke, and sooner or later, the student might be sent after the master, or the other way around. They didn't ask for this life, but they lived it anyway, not with pride, not with shame, just with necessity. There were nights curled in corners of barns or beneath broken roofs, when they remembered who they'd once been: a boy who liked carving wood, a girl who hummed when it rained, a pair of hands not yet stained. But the road never bent backward, not for people like them, so they kept walking forward, deeper into the shadows, because there was no one left to pull them out. Blood for bread, not glory. The tales say they were shadows with blades, that they moved like ghosts, that they were silent, noble, devoted to causes, whispered in candlelit halls. But real assassins weren't in it for glory. They weren't knights, sworn to chivalry. They weren't prophets. Most didn't care about kings or kingdoms, or who wore the crown. They took lives for bread. Literally, at times. Payment wasn't always a heavy purse. Sometimes it was food, warmth, shelter for one night in the dead of winter, a wool cloak before the snow came in. A quiet job might earn a copper coin, enough for crusty bread, watery ale, and a space by the fire. A harder job? A silver maybe. But silvers were rare. Silvers were dangerous. You didn't get paid well unless the person you were sent to kill mattered, and if they mattered, someone would come looking. So most of them lived job to job, quiet, invisible, hoping their names stayed out of the stories, because fame was fatal in their world. Once people knew who you were, they knew how to find you, and someone, somewhere, always had a bigger purse. There were no monuments for them, no ballads, no faces etched in stone. If they were remembered at all, it was in rumors, in warnings. A man vanished after market. No trace, no witnesses. A lord died in his sleep, but his guards were found with broken necks. A girl from the alley went missing. 2 days later, a merchant was buried without his tongue. It was ugly work. Lonely work. But they did it because no one else would take them, or because they'd done it once, and that was enough to make them untouchable in any other trade. Even the guilds wouldn't have them. A man who could end a life without blinking wasn't someone you wanted stirring vats or shaping shoes, so they took what they could. Some learned to poison. Some used garrotes made from horsehair or silk. Others favored knives, not for flash, but for control. Clean, close, quiet. The work changed them, not just in the hands or the eyes that scanned every rooftop and shadow. It changed them in the silences, in how they ate, in how they slept, always near a door, never fully asleep. They didn't speak of honor, they didn't expect forgiveness, just coin, and sometimes, not even that. A trade of shadows. It wasn't listed in any ledger. There were no stalls, no signs, no open apprenticeships. But in every crowded medieval town, if you knew the right corner to wait in, or the right man to pay, a different kind of market opened. A trade built not on goods, but on silence, on secrets, on blood. They called it many things. The black work, the quiet path, the night's bargain. But it was all the same, lives traded in the dark, one whisper at a time, If you needed someone gone permanently, you didn't shout, you didn't write. You found someone who knew someone. A go-between, a broker, sometimes just a man selling fish, or a washerwoman with too many scars. They passed messages, names, times, never coin at first, only intent. Because this trade didn't run on trust, it ran on fear, on careful favors, on the knowledge that if you lied to a killer, the killer might come for you next. No guild protected them, no badge or mark declared their work. That was the point. They were supposed to vanish, not stand out. The best were ghosts with habits. One always left the candle still lit, another arranged the shoes by the bed. Subtle signs, for those who knew. But more often, the work was clumsy, brutal, carried out by desperate men with hungry mouths at home. A sharpened nail, a club, a cord wrapped in shaking hands, and yet even the worst of them played a part in the system. One that had quietly grown, generation after generation, fed by poverty and politics. Sometimes, a noble hired a man to clear a rival. Sometimes a jealous husband paid for a quiet solution. Sometimes it was revenge for a brother, or the soft grief of a mother who wanted justice no court would give. But always, it happened in the cracks. Beneath the noise of the markets and the songs in the square, this other world breathed, watched, waited. And those within it knew once you took one life for coin, you were in the trade. There was no forgetting, no return to honest work. You were a shadow, and shadows did not retire. Who hired the blade? It was never the blade who chose the moment. Not truly. The assassin was simply the final whisper in a long chain of secrets. The last hand in a deeper game. Long before the dagger was unsheathed, or the vial of poison was uncorked, the story began in shadows cast by other people's motives. People who rarely touched a weapon, and never dirtied their own hands. You see, assassins did not wander through life hunting at random. They were summoned, and the one who called them forth was rarely the villain one expected. A silk-robed merchant might pass by unnoticed in the square, his smile gentle, his purse heavy. But in the back of his shop, beneath the loose stone in the floor, there were scrolls with names and payments, ledgers of favors traded in quiet. A rival accused of fraud, or a cousin blocking his trade routes, removed, quietly, permanently, and the coin flowed like wine. Then there were the highborn, lords and ladies who wrapped their sins in etiquette. A whispered slight at court, a younger brother in line for inheritance, a troublesome witness to a secret betrothal. These things were not argued over. They were erased. Sometimes the assassin never saw their true employer. A message would be delivered through 3 hands, a stable boy, a beggar woman, a monk who kept no name. The instructions came as riddles, symbols, or codes. A lock of hair, a scrap of a seal, a coin marked with a dent in its edge. And the coin was always given first. Always, because in this profession, trust was scarce. Assassins were many things, but trusting wasn't one of them. There were brokers too, men and women who made it their trade to know who wanted someone dead. They ran brothels, inns, kitchens in castle basements. They watched faces and remembered grievances. If you wanted someone gone, you went to them, quietly, desperately. Sometimes the person who hired the assassin was pitiful, tears on their face, coin clutched in trembling hands. A mother whose son had vanished after offending the local reeve. A maid who'd been wronged by a knight. They didn't see it as murder. They saw it as justice. But not all were so emotional. Some were cold, clean, professional. You'll find him at the church by dawn, they'd say. He wears a blue ring. Make it look like robbery. They spoke the way one might request firewood for winter. Occasionally the assassin would discover more than they were meant to. The client's real name. A hidden motive. A second intended target. That knowledge, too dangerous to carry, could seal their fate. Assassins who asked too many questions sometimes vanished before their job was done. And then there were the false hires. The traps. A rival assassin trying to eliminate competition. A noble wanting to catch the killer red-handed, to curry favor with the king. These weren't just deadly, they were humiliating. So who hired the blade? Sometimes a weeping woman with nothing to lose, sometimes a noble with everything to protect, sometimes the man you just passed in the alley, and sometimes the person you trusted most. The Whisper Network. They never called it that. The Whisper Network. But it's what it was. Not a guild, not a brotherhood. Nothing official or organized, no banners, no lodges, no secret handshakes. Just the weight of knowing, looks exchanged in candle-lit halls, nods passed at the edge of market crowds, a slip of paper tucked into a boot instead of a mailbox. If you were in it, you knew, and if you weren't, you never would. The Whisper Network wasn't built on trust. It was built on necessity. Assassins could not survive alone, not really. They needed information more than they needed coin. Who was hiring and who was hunting? Who had changed sides? Who had disappeared? There were no public notices for jobs like theirs. No postings on the church door. The work came through breath and shadow, through rumors, passed in low voices over boiling pots or shared between servants cleaning blood from flagstones. The cooks knew, the washerwomen, the stable boys, the gate guards, the women who poured the wine and the men who lit the fires, the invisible ones who heard everything and said nothing. And through them, the network spread. An old woman selling herbs in the square might mutter about a fox too bold in the prince's henhouse. That meant a noble had grown careless, and someone wanted him gone. A crooked merchant offering apples from the wrong season might be signaling a payment drop. A certain flower in a certain vase in a certain window. A silent message. It's safe, or it's not. It wasn't always clear. You had to know how to listen, to filter what mattered from what didn't. The Whisper Network wasn't just about receiving, it was about reading the room before it had words. And if you misunderstood the whisper, you died. Assassins rarely spoke to each other directly. If they did, it was usually in disguise, or through intermediaries. The network had no names, only nicknames. Titles like the Inkman, or She with Silver Buttons. No one asked who they really were. Names were dangerous. Sometimes you'd go years without knowing who passed you your last 3 jobs. Sometimes you'd never find out who paid you. Sometimes you realized too late you'd been working for someone who wanted you dead next. But the whispers kept coming, through lips half closed, eyes glancing sideways, feet shifting nervously. There were taverns where no one ever asked for your name. Inns with 3 locks on every door. A certain well in the hills where those in the trade left offerings, wrapped coins, bone tokens, dried petals. Small symbols that meant I need work, or I need help, or farewell. The Whisper Network was no safety net, but it was the closest thing assassins had. Not family, not friends. Just fellow shadows passing in the night, exchanging slivers of truth to keep from being swallowed whole. And in this world of secrets, the one rule was simple. Speak only what you must, and listen to everything else. Learning to vanish. You didn't learn it in a school. No scrolls, no oaths, just the world around you, and the need to disappear inside it. To learn vanishing wasn't just to hide in a dark alley or slip into a crowd. It was to dissolve, to become less than noticed, to be looked at and not seen. For most assassins, it began long before their first job. In childhood, crouched beneath floorboards, while men shouted above, or in narrow corridors of noble homes. When servants learned to make themselves silent, you watched, you waited. You became a still thing in a world that never stopped moving. To vanish was to know how people saw, what they paid attention to, and what they always overlooked. A beggar with a limp moved through cities unseen. A maid carrying wine was invisible. A boy with dirt under his nails could walk past a night unnoticed. You learned to become any of them. A cloak too fine drew eyes, a gait too hurried raised questions. But smudge your face with ash, stoop just enough, mutter a few nonsense words to yourself, and you passed through even guarded gates with nothing more than a glance. Stillness was key, but not too still. Movement was necessary, but not too quick. A shadow that moved like any other didn't stir suspicion, but one that lingered, even for a breath too long, might invite a closer look, and that couldn't be risked. You learned to count footsteps, to gauge angles of light, to hear a floorboard creak and know it would creak again if you stepped there. Some swore by charcoal on the cheeks to dull the skin's reflection. Others carried soft wax to take impressions of keys or coins. And always, you memorized the exits. Before you entered a room, you knew how you'd leave it. If the door closed behind you, you made note of every window, every loose stone, every ladder or ledge or line of laundry that might carry you safely back into the dark. To vanish wasn't magic, it was a craft. It meant spending hours in plain sight and going unnoticed. It meant learning how to be someone else entirely, or no one at all. The best assassins never left a trace. No footprints, no fibers, no broken lock, no startled dog, no pattern of noise, only a cold body and a whisper. A lesson in silence. Most people think silence is easy. Just don't speak, right? Walk softly, hold your breath, but for a medieval assassin, silence wasn't just about quiet. It was survival. It was the difference between slipping out into the night or hanging by your ankles from the town gate the next morning. Silence was something you had to learn, and not from a book. You learned it the hard way, through bruises, failures, close calls, maybe from the sharp end of a trainer's boot, or worse, from a job that went wrong and left you hiding in a latrine pit until the shouting died down. It began with your body. Every step you took had to be felt before it was made. Stone floors were different from wooden ones. A hallway with damp, moss-muffled sound. But old wood, especially in noble houses, creaked if you even breathed the wrong way. You didn't just learn to walk, you learned to predict your own noise, which floorboard groaned, which door hinge would betray you, which patch of gravel outside the stable would slide under your heel if you moved too fast. There was a method to the quiet. You'd wrap the soles of your boots with cloth, even if it made running harder. You'd pad metal buckles with soft leather. You never carried coins loose. Even your weapons had to be silent. No clinking blades or shifting scabbards. Everything had to stay where it was, and not say a word. But silence wasn't just about footsteps, it was about patience. Sometimes you had to wait for hours, tucked behind a curtain, wedged between hay bales, crouched beneath a banquet table. You couldn't cough, couldn't shift your weight, couldn't scratch your leg, even if mice ran across your boots. You waited until the breathing in the next room changed, until the guards rotated, until the wind masked your exit. And in those long, aching waits, silence got inside your head. It made your thoughts louder. You'd hear every beat of your heart, every drop of sweat rolling down your back. You'd listen to your own breath until it didn't sound human anymore. And still, you had to be ready to move in perfect silence the moment the chance came. There were nights when silence meant holding a hand over someone's mouth before they could cry out. You'd see the fear in their eyes. Maybe they were innocent, maybe not. But it didn't matter. If they made a noise, it was over, for both of you. You weren't just trained to be quiet, you were trained to make quiet. Fast, final, brutal quiet. And even outside the job, silence stayed with you. You didn't laugh loudly, you didn't shout. You sat at the edge of the tavern, close to the wall, eyes on the door. You startled easily. You never trusted music, or the sound of too much joy. It made you feel like something was wrong, like something was missing. Most people never noticed the silence in their lives. But for you, it was always there. It was what you left behind in every hallway, every corridor, every moonlit garden path. It followed you home and wrapped itself around your sleep. There's a reason assassins rarely grew old. Not because they were killed, but because the silence became too heavy. They say the blade is what kills. But that's only the end of the story. Long before that, it was silence that made the first cut. The price of a name. It always started with a name, slipped across a table, murmured, in a dark alley, written in ink that smeared from a sweating palm. But names weren't free, not to speak, and never to take. In the world of blades and shadows, a name was more than just a target. It was a weight, a debt, a risk. Because the moment someone gave you a name, they also gave you the burden that came with it. And once you took it, once you nodded and pocketed the coin, there was no going back. You didn't just carry the name in your head, you wore it like a second skin. You began to watch for it, even when you didn't mean to. You listened for it in market chatter, traced it through whispers, studied its movements like you were learning the pattern of a storm. And if the name belonged to someone important, someone protected by walls, guards, or God, then the price wasn't just silver, it was time, nerves, sleep. You started with questions, quiet ones. Who did they trust? Who owed them favors? Who would notice if they stopped showing up to morning mass, or skipped their evening wine? Sometimes it was simple, a noble caught in scandal, a merchant who crossed the wrong family. But sometimes, the name led you into a mess too tangled to see through. Old grudges, hidden heirs, debts that went deeper than you were paid to understand. The more important the name, the more dangerous the silence around it. There were names that got you followed, names that made people lock their doors when you passed. Names that once spoken turned the air colder in the room, and you couldn't say you hadn't been warned, because every coin slid across the table had its own kind of chill. And yet, you took it. Because once you entered that world, once your hands had closed around even one name, you became someone who could never walk away clean. You couldn't tell anyone, of course, not even the other blades. Everyone walked alone in that trade. Names were your burden to bear, and once you carried one, it was yours to finish. Some jobs came quickly, others dragged for weeks, but each time, once it was done, you'd lie awake afterward, staring at the dark ceiling above your bed, whispering that name to yourself. Not because you were proud of it, but because you needed to remember who you'd been paid to forget. That was the true cost. You could take the coin, you could vanish into the night, but you always took the name with you. Watching from rooftops. It wasn't always blades and blood. Some nights, it was just waiting. The rooftops were colder than they looked from below. Up there, the wind could sneak through seams in your cloak, and the tiles, slick with moss or rain, shifted just enough to keep you alert. But that's where you spent the hours, crouched in shadow, above a world that never looked back up. From the street, no one ever imagined eyes were watching from the eaves. That was the whole point. You learned to read buildings like maps. Which ones slanted, which had chimneys you could brace against, which ones had rafters you could nestle into for hours without being seen. In time, your body adjusted, knees settling into creases in the wood, back resting just right along the stone angles. Still, silent, a shadow with breath, below, the world kept moving. Candles in windows flickered like stars. Dogs barked, coins changed hands. Lovers argued, guards passed by with their halberds, boots loud and careless on the cobbles. They never looked up, and there always there was the one you watched. Maybe they didn't know they were being hunted. Maybe they did, and kept their shutters tight each night, just in case. But you saw them, at their window, at their prayers, drinking, laughing, weeping, sometimes. You saw more than you ever expected. And that's where things got complicated. It's easy to take a job when it's just a name, just a purse full of coin, and a brief description. But it's harder once you've watched. Once you've seen the target stroke their child's hair, or slip bread to a beggar, or kiss someone on the forehead. The rooftop gave you more than just advantage. It gave you hesitation. Some assassins avoided the rooftops for that reason. Too much time. Too many thoughts. But if you were good, really good, you waited anyway. Because that's what the job demanded. You watched for patterns, for habits, for gaps in protection. You mapped their life without ever being part of it. And in doing so, you became something in between. Not friend, not ghost, just a watcher. You weren't supposed to care. You told yourself you didn't. But even in the quietest night, when no blade was drawn and no name was crossed out, something in you shifted. Because when you live on rooftops, you learn that distance doesn't always keep you safe. And sometimes, the hardest part of the job wasn't climbing the building. It was climbing down. The dagger's weight. They always told you to travel light. No armor, no banner, nothing that clanked or caught the moonlight. Just soft boots, quiet breath, and the dagger. At first, it seemed small, a tool, nothing more, barely longer than your forearm. Simple steel, darkened handle, no ornament to catch the eye. It was meant to disappear with you, vanish into the shadows, just as easily as it slipped between ribs, easy to carry, easy to hide. But what no one warned you about was how heavy it would become. It started with the first time, that first job, the way your hand shook when it was over, the warmth on your fingers, the sound, if you could call it that, of someone slipping from life to death. The dagger didn't feel light, then. It felt like it had doubled in weight, tripled, and when you cleaned it, it didn't shine the same way again. They say weapons remember, and maybe they do, because every time you unsheathed it, something else seemed to echo back. Not a voice, not a cry, just a presence, a memory in the hilt. Yours, or someone else's, you could never tell. You tried carrying it differently, tucked behind your back, at your thigh, inside your boot. But no matter where it rested, you always knew exactly where it was. It became part of your posture, part of your gait, like an extra bone in your body, foreign, but fused. Some days, it saved your life. Quick draw, precise strike, clean escape. That was the trade. Risk for reward, blade for breath. But even then, it never quite felt like victory, only relief. You had survived, but something still pressed down on you when you finally sat still. Other assassins carried swords, axes, poison rings. You never understood how they did it, all that weight, all that mess. But in the quiet, with just your dagger resting on your thigh, you realized that it didn't matter how big or small the weapon was. The burden came after. You kept it sharp, because a dull blade meant a cruel death. You wrapped it in cloth when it wasn't in use, and never gave it a name. Names made things harder, closer. Sometimes you thought about leaving it behind, dropping it into a river, hiding it under stone. But always, something stopped you. Because the dagger wasn't just a tool anymore, it was a reminder, not of the lives you'd taken, but of what it had taken from you. The silence, the sleep, the softness you once had in your hands. And no matter how far you traveled, no matter how dark the night, you could always feel it there, not just on your belt, but in your shadow. Sleepless in the straw. There's nothing quite like the quiet of a barn after midnight. The hay has settled, the animals have too. A low grunt from the pig, a soft shifting from the mule. Even the mice go still eventually, satisfied with their stolen grains and careful not to draw too much attention. And in the corner, half covered in burlap, cloaked and still is you. You hadn't planned to sleep in the barn. No one ever really plans for that. But when you've got blood on your boots and a city watch asking the wrong questions, even a pile of damp straw behind a goat stall can start to feel like sanctuary. You try to relax, let your breathing match the sway of the rafters overhead, but your body never forgets its job. One ear is tuned to footsteps, real or imagined. One hand rests lightly on the blade beneath your wrappings. Your muscles pretend to rest, but there's always that tension, like a bowstring held just shy of loosing. You haven't slept properly in days, not since the job in the northern port, not since the nobleman who wasn't supposed to scream did just that. And not since you saw the look on that stable boy's face when he stumbled into the alley after you were gone. No one teaches you how to sleep after these things. No guildmaster or mentor gives you a scroll with answers. You just do your best, lay low, breathe, hope the straw isn't full of fleas and that no one recognizes the cut of your cloak if they peek in. The roof above you leaks in 3 places. You count them, 1, 2, 3. It helps slow the mind. Each drip a soft marker in time, each one helping to dull the edge of the memory, just enough maybe to allow a few moments of shallow sleep. And just when your eyes flutter shut, something stirs, a creak, a hinge, no, just the wind, or was it? You tense, wait, nothing, only the mule snorting softly, shifting in its stall. You exhale again. This is the cost, isn't it? Not just coin for the risk, but the quiet, crawling dread. The restless nights where even the straw feels like it's watching you, where every creak is a sword, every shadow a trap, and yet come morning, you'll rise, wash your face at a trough, eat whatever's left from the crust in your pocket, and vanish down the next road like you were never here. Because that's what it means to live by the blade, to walk through the world known by no one, remembered by even fewer, and to sleep not in beds, but in borrowed corners of forgotten barns, where the straw is dry, the roof mostly holds, and the silence is deep enough to hide everything but your own heartbeat. Guilds, gangs, and hidden masters. You might think assassins worked alone, silhouettes in moonlight, ghosts on rooftops. One blade, one name, no ties. That's the romantic version, the one whispered in taverns after too much ale. But the truth was quieter, and far more complicated. No one survives this trade alone for long. In the underworld of medieval cities, nothing happened in isolation. Behind every quiet killing, there was a network. Sometimes it looked like a guild, a secret society with codes, rituals, and quiet halls hidden behind butcher shops or bakeries. Other times it was messier, less organized, just a handful of criminals, bound together by mutual secrets and mutual fear, taking work when it came and watching their backs when it didn't. And then there were the hidden masters. No one ever saw their faces, not really. Sometimes they went by names that weren't names. The fox, the mason, the widow. They rarely spoke above a whisper, and never showed up in daylight. But they pulled strings. They knew which bishop had offended the wrong noble, which merchant was skimming from the wrong chest, which courier to stop before he reached the border. You didn't find them, they found you. If you were lucky, you'd get a letter, sealed in red wax tucked into your boot while you slept, or slipped into your hand by a child in a crowded street. If you were less lucky, the invitation came in the form of a visit, a warning, a threat. You could say no, but you wouldn't, not really. The masters gave you work, but they also gave you protection of a kind. Without them, you'd be just another criminal. With them you had a role, a purpose, a little insulation between you and the gallows. Still, it wasn't glamorous. The guild houses were damp and dim, the food was cheap, the beds worse. Some nights you cleaned your blade beside a chimney sweep or a cutpurse who couldn't stop shaking. No matter how secret the job, word always leaked, trickled out in whispers through the city's underbelly. Everyone seemed to know just enough to fear you, but never enough to help you. And not all masters were worthy of the name. Some were cruel, reckless, sending boys barely old enough to hold a knife into palaces, then vanishing when the job went wrong. Others demanded silence, obedience, and complete anonymity. You weren't a person anymore, just a tool. There were rules too, unwritten, but known. No jobs on feast days, never kill a priest, never take a contract on another guild member, unless the master says so, and if you were caught, you said nothing. Ever, your tongue was worth less than your life, and neither were worth much to begin with. So no, you weren't alone. You had a gang, a guild, a master you never met. You shared bread with poisoners and watched backs with smugglers. You slept in corners, met at dawn, and vanished before dusk. And when you walked the streets, cloak drawn tight, every lantern flicker cast a shadow that might be one of your own. When nobles wanted death, you might imagine a noble, cloaked in velvet, sipping spiced wine, rings glittering on every finger, would never lower themselves to speak to someone like a killer. But you'd be wrong. The higher the tower, the longer the shadows it casts. And in medieval courts, the most delicate tapestries often hid the darkest stains. Assassins didn't just answer to street gangs or whisper networks, they answered to lords and ladies too, not directly of course. That would be scandalous. But through layers of messengers, cloaked go-betweens, and sometimes even priests who claimed they were hearing a different kind of confession, the reasons varied. Sometimes it was inheritance, too many sons, not enough land. Sometimes it was love, a jealous baroness whose heart had turned bitter. And sometimes it was fear. A letter intercepted, a rumor whispered too close to the wrong ear, and suddenly a noble needed a loose end cut cleanly. And that's when they turned to the blade, in the dark. It always started with a soft summons, never a name, just a meeting place. A stable at dusk, a mill house at first light, a coin purse that jingled too much, followed by a voice that never turned to face you. This is delicate, they'd say. Discretion is everything. They wanted you invisible, silent, fast, and they wanted no blood on their silks. But here's the thing about noblemen and noblewomen. They rarely understood what they were asking for. They thought it was simple: name, coin, death. But once someone of noble birth ordered a killing, they were stepping into a world that did not play by courtly rules. A world of oaths, knives, silence, and shadows that didn't forget. Assassins, of course, didn't trust nobles. Not really, not ever. Nobles were the type to deny everything if things went wrong. The type to point fingers or send guards in the night. That's why the guilds kept records, coded, hidden, layered with false names, but just true enough to hold weight. Insurance. Because if you were going to kill for a crown, you needed something to protect yourself from it too. And yet, nobles kept hiring, because war was expensive, power was fragile, and sometimes people just got in the way. An ambitious cousin, a rebellious vassal, a merchant who knew too much. Better, they reasoned, for it to end quietly. No duel, no scandal, just a disappearance. A hunting accident, a fall from a tower no one saw. And the coin was always heavier when it came from a noble's purse. Heavier, but not cleaner. Some killers refused noble contracts, too risky, too visible. Others saw them as trophies, marks of importance, but all of them knew this. When a noble wanted someone dead, they didn't want just a body. They wanted a memory erased, a threat removed, a future rewritten. And when the job was done, and the coin changed hands, there was never a thank you, only silence. And sometimes, if you were unlucky, another contract. This time with your own name on it. Because in noble games, even the dagger gets discarded when it's no longer useful. Assassins among monks. They say the quietest places hold the deepest secrets. And in the medieval world, few places were quieter than a monastery. Stone walls, echoing with chants, gardens of herbs and silence, scrolls drying in candlelight, brothers in robes, walking slowly between duties, eyes lowered, hands folded. To most, these were places of peace. Holy ground, a refuge from war, from hunger, from the chaos of the world outside. But not always. Sometimes a man entered the cloister not to find God, but to hide from death, or to deliver it. Assassins didn't just live in alleyways and smoky taverns. Some disappeared behind the walls of abbeys. Not many, just a few, enough to whisper about. They took on names like Brother Thomas or Brother Aaron. They shaved their heads. They learned the prayers. They knelt during Vespers and broke bread at dawn. To anyone watching, they were just another penitent soul, come to do penance or perhaps atone. But behind their stillness was intent. Sometimes they were hiding from a contract gone wrong, changing identities, burying blades in dirt cellars beneath the herb garden. Sometimes they were sent there, on purpose, because someone inside the monastery needed to die. You might wonder, how could a monk be a target? But monasteries held more than just prayer. They were banks, record keepers, power centers. Abbots wielded influence. They whispered to kings, held lands, controlled tithes, and more than one had enemies. Nobles, rival clergy, even members of their own order. And so, sometimes, a man would be sent, not with a sword, not with poison in the chalice, but slowly, patiently, days of watching, earning trust, finding the right moment when a candle burned too close to old parchment, or when a certain stairwell was left unswept, its stones slick with moss. Death in a monastery had to look like an accident, or divine will, and the killer, he'd remain. For years sometimes, learning Latin, copying scripture, growing older with the brothers, fading into their quiet routine. A shadow turned flesh, but make no mistake, he never forgot who he was. Not fully. He might pray, he might tend the sick, but he always listened for footsteps, always knew the nearest exit, always noticed who asked too many questions. In time, he might come to believe in the silence, the peace, the rhythm of bells and prayer. But sometimes, peace wasn't enough. The past would catch up, or the guild would send word again. One parchment, one name, slipped beneath his cell door, and just like that, Brother Thomas would disappear. The monks would say he left for another abbey, or that he was called to pilgrimage, or simply vanished, like so many others in that quiet, uncertain age, and the silence would return, as if he had never been there at all. The market square disguise. There's a strange comfort to a busy market, the clatter of carts on cobblestone, the soft bleating of goats tied to wooden posts, merchants calling out in worn voices, offering spools of dyed wool, saltfish, sacks of barley, the smell of fresh bread mingling with dung, smoke and sweat, a place alive, always moving. And in that noise, a man could vanish. The assassin walked slowly, not hurried, not cautious, just another shape in the crowd. He wore no hood today, just a patched tunic, sleeves rolled to the elbow, dust on his boots, a woven basket under one arm. Inside the basket, onions, turnips, and beneath them, a coil of twine, a small file, and a skinning blade, no longer than his thumb. It was a good place for a kill. No walls, no guards, just strangers brushing past one another, too busy haggling over the price of flour to notice a man collapse beside a mule. His target came every third market day, a spice trader from the lowlands, now working for a merchant guild with interests in the wrong towns. Someone had paid dearly for silence. The assassin knew the rhythms of the square. When the city watch made their rounds, which stalls sold wine, watered enough to keep a man talking, long enough for the work to be done. But that day, things shifted. The spice trader wasn't alone. A boy walked with him, maybe 10 years old, pale hair, curious eyes, asking questions about every sack of pepper and cinnamon they passed. The assassin hesitated, turned down a different lane. There were always rules, some made by the guild, others kept quietly by the men who lived long enough to grow old in this work. One of them was simple: no witnesses that couldn't forget. He bought carrots he didn't need, paid too much for a slab of goat cheese, waited, watched. At midday the spice trader handed the boy off to a servant and returned alone. The assassin adjusted his basket, crossed the square, smiled at a linen vendor, and passed by the spice trader just close enough. A small scratch on the man's wrist, nothing more, a thorn in the crowd. He was dead by sundown. No one saw it happen. No chase, no blood, just another man who'd eaten something strange or drunk too much wine too fast. The local surgeon shrugged. These things happened. By then the assassin was gone, back on the road with his basket empty, just another traveler with sore feet, a coin pouch half full, and no name worth asking for. And behind him the market went on, just as it always had. A life with no last name. He had names, of course, dozens of them. Some were whispers used only once, in backroom dealings or on brittle parchment soon tossed in fire. Others he wore for months, like old coats, fitting into villages where no one asked questions, so long as you paid for your bread and nodded at the priest. But none of those names were his. His real one, if it ever mattered, was buried somewhere far behind him, like a stone in the river, smoothed over, forgotten, left for the current to wear down. A life without a last name wasn't always tragic. It was quieter, in its way. You walked through towns like a ghost, seen, but never truly known, and when you left, it was as if you'd never been there at all. He remembered once, long ago, a woman had asked for it. Just his name. She had kind eyes, a weaver's daughter in a rainy town near the northern coast. She gave him warm stew, and never pressed too hard about why his hands were always stained, or why he kept a dagger near the hearth, even when he slept. She asked softly, almost in passing, while they watched the fire, "What should I call you, really?" He had paused, then smiled, lied of course. And when he left a week later, before the snow came in, he left behind no letter, no coin, just silence. That was the way of it, to belong to no place, to carry no history, to be nothing but what you needed to be that day: a sailor, a guard, a butcher's helper, a limping farmer with a scar no one dared to ask about. And in the ledger books of life, in all the careful parchments of noble courts and town records, there was never a line where his name was written down, but in the shadows, he was known. By those who paid well, and those who feared quiet knocks at night. To them he didn't need a last name. He was just the one who came when others couldn't, the one who left no trace, the one who never asked for thanks or forgiveness, just silence, always silence. Venom, rope, and razor. Not every job called for a blade. Sometimes it was easier to let gravity do the work, or time, or a bitter sip from a borrowed cup. The assassin's tools were never just steel and shadow. There were other weapons, quieter, crueler, and far less heroic. And more often than not, they got the job done better. Venom was for those who slept well and trusted too easily, mixed into wine, or drizzled into ink pots, or tucked into the hollow stem of a quill. There were poisons that worked fast, frothing lips, eyes wide with confusion, but the assassin preferred the slow ones. The ones that took days, that looked like fever, or guilt, or old age, finally catching up. A rope, well, rope was messy and personal. It didn't require skill, just patience and timing. A hallway with no guards, a stairwell no one used after dark, a cellar door that clicked shut behind you. He never liked using rope, too close, too many faces, but sometimes it was what the job called for. And then there was the razor, small, clean, easy to carry. He kept one in a boot, another in a sleeve, and always one sewn inside the collar of his coat. Not for others, necessarily, but for himself, just in case, because the work wasn't always perfect. Plans failed, exits collapsed. Sometimes you found yourself in a locked room with no window and too many questions. And in those moments, a single clean line across the throat was better than weeks in a dungeon. There were apprentices once who asked about swords, about glory in duels, and open fights in the street. He'd laughed softly, the way only someone truly tired can laugh. Real assassins didn't fight fair. They didn't wait for chances. They made them. With venom, rope, and razor, they didn't care about songs. Only silence. And when the job was done, there were no banners raised, just a quiet room. A still body, and a door left slightly open to let in the cold night air. The cold mathematics of murder. There was nothing glamorous about it. No poetry, no drama. No whispered names passed in candlelit halls or glinting blades beneath moonlight. To the ones who lived it, who survived by it, murder was a calculation, nothing more. He would sit by the fire, perhaps sharpening his knife, perhaps not, a bowl of stew in his lap, gone cold from thought. Across the room, a mark, not the mark, just a coin payer. Someone too rich to get their hands dirty, too petty to risk open feud, and too afraid to let grudges die. The assassin listened, always quiet, never asking why. The reasons were irrelevant. What mattered were the details: time, place, route, routine. That's what made the difference. That's what got you home alive. A noble might say, "He insulted my daughter." A merchant might sneer, He cost me 3 shipments of dye. A bishop might mutter, he knows things he shouldn't. But to the man with the blade, these motives were white noise. His mind was already elsewhere. He thought in angles, in alley widths, in which streets echoed footsteps, and which ones swallowed them. He thought about fabric, whether silk fluttered and betrayed movement, or wool muffled it. He considered torchlight, and where it would blind a guard, or backlight a silhouette. He thought about food markets, where livestock made noise and children ran wild. Chaos was useful, crowds were cover. He never thought about guilt, that would have been dangerous. When he killed, it was almost never with flair. An accident was preferred, a slip from a ledge, a bad fall down wet stairs, a heart attack helped along by a little belladonna in the wine. He prided himself on being forgettable. Some clients didn't like that. They wanted blood, but he wasn't in the business of shows, and if he was lucky, he never had to draw his blade at all. That's where the math came in. Every mission was a sum. How many doors, how many eyes, how many minutes of moonlight. Every job had a price not only in coin, but in risk. And every wrong answer meant someone found you, or worse, someone remembered you. He kept notes, not written ones, only fools did that. But in his head, a ledger of moves that worked, and ones that didn't. A list of names not because he cared, but because they'd taught him something. And he remembered the ones that almost got him killed. The man with the dog, the woman with the perfume laced in arsenic, the guard who looked drunk but wasn't. He had nightmares sometimes, not of the faces he killed. He couldn't remember most of them. No, the dreams that haunted him were the near misses. The silent guards behind doors that should have creaked. The loose bricks that nearly cost him footing. The child's ball rolling into the street at the wrong time. It was the randomness that gnawed at him, the variable that couldn't be planned. So he adapted. He learned to control what he could and forget what he couldn't. He became faster, colder. He stopped asking questions. He stopped needing reasons, because the truth was the ones who survived weren't the best with a blade. They were the ones who calculated the odds before anyone else even saw the board. And in a world of chaos and knives, that was the only math that mattered. Fear travels faster than footsteps. It always moved ahead of him. Fear, like a shadow that arrived before he ever did, before he ever slipped into the alleys, before his boots touched the courtyard cobbles, before the mark even knew he'd been watched. Fear was already there, not loud, not even spoken, but felt, in a glance too quick, a candle snuffed too early, a door bolted that hadn't been bolted the night before. No matter how silent he was, fear made noise. It stirred the household air. It crept through closed shutters. It whispered behind pews and lingered in doorways. It did the work for him, softened nerves, slowed reflexes, made men clumsy. There was a pattern to it. He'd seen it many times. First came suspicion, a misplaced cup, a footstep on gravel that wasn't there the night before, then restlessness. The mark would change habits, leave earlier, come home later. Paranoia bloomed next, new guards hired, new routes taken, friends questioned, and finally, isolation. The target would pull back, shut out the world, not knowing that solitude made it easier, not harder to reach them. He relied on fear, cultivated it, even, not theatrically. He didn't leave calling cards or paint threats in blood, but he'd make sure a servant saw him where he shouldn't be. Let a whisper slip in a tavern, just enough to plant a seed. Because once fear started to grow, it did more damage than a blade ever could. People stopped thinking clearly. They double-checked windows and forgot to watch their own backs. They tightened their inner circles and let in someone they shouldn't have. Sometimes, he wouldn't even have to act. The threat alone was enough. A well-timed knock, a flash of steel in the night. Rumor did the rest. One man even poisoned himself, convinced it would be less painful than what he imagined was coming. That was the strange part. What they imagined was always worse than what was real. He didn't take pleasure in that. It was just a truth he'd come to know. The mind is a crueler killer than any knife. And so he watched, always a step behind fear, never needing to run. He moved slowly, carefully, because the faster the heart beat in the mark's chest, the calmer his own became. He would wait until the silence was unbearable, until the dread became a constant ache, an invisible weight, until the mark could no longer sleep, no longer eat, could barely speak a sentence without glancing at the window. That was when the job was easiest. That was when they were already halfway dead. He didn't always need to be the storm. Sometimes, fear was enough. Assassins versus spies. The difference was never as clear as the guilds liked to pretend. Ask a noble, and they might say a spy gathers secrets while an assassin ends lives. Ask a guildmaster, and they'd speak of honor and purpose, of lines drawn in blood or ink. But ask someone who's been both, and they'd just smirk. Because in the end, both jobs started the same way. Silence, shadows, and a name whispered in the dark. The assassin watched from rooftops. The spy sat by the hearth and listened. One carried poison in a ring, the other wore it on their tongue. But both worked alone, both lied for a living, and both knew how to disappear. In some cities, the roles blurred so much they were the same, especially in courts where secrets were more dangerous than blades. Assassins were hired not just to kill, but to warn, to frighten. Sometimes a clean kill wasn't even the goal. A message was, a disappearance, a spectacle, a shift in fear. Spies, meanwhile, were sometimes ordered to do worse. Slip a vial into the wine, tamper with the steps leading to a noble's tower, deliver a false letter with deadly consequences. No blade involved, but no less fatal. The key difference, if there was one, was in what they valued. Spies worked in webs, patience, deception. They gathered, hoarded, traded truths. Their power lay in what they knew, in what others didn't. Assassins, they didn't need time, only certainty. A name, a face, a place. No second chances, no long games. Just one moment, done well, and then gone. The two often crossed paths. An assassin might be contracted to silence a spy. A spy might use an assassin's reputation to shape a political narrative. Sometimes they even worked together, rarely, but it happened. One digging up secrets, the other removing obstacles. But trust that never lasted. Because in a world of liars and killers, everyone knew too much, and nobody ever forgot a betrayal. There were rumors of assassins turned spies, and spies who, after one mission too many, found they were better with a knife than with words. They said those were the most dangerous ones of all. People who could kill without touching you, who could learn your darkest secret and then decide whether to ruin your life or simply end it. In the end, it wasn't about titles, it was about power, and in the quiet corners of the world, power always belonged to those who could vanish before the scream began. The church's watchful eyes. The church knew everything, or at least, it wanted people to think it did. In towns lit only by torchlight and prayer, nothing stirred without the notice of a priest or a monk. In cities where bells rang out across tiled rooftops, the clergy held more power than kings. And for those who worked in the shadows, assassins, spies, informers, this power was both a curse and a cover. The church's eyes were everywhere, and not all of them belonged to God. Confessionals were whispered gold mines. A noble afraid for his soul might let slip the name of someone he'd rather see dead. A merchant tangled in sin might trade secrets for forgiveness. And not every priest forgot what he heard when he walked away. Some did more than listen. There were abbots with private ledgers, bishops with silent partnerships, orders of monks who trained not just in scripture, but in codes and languages and poisons. Some served God, others served causes. A few served only themselves. To the church, murder was sin. But to certain corners of the church, so was heresy, so was rebellion, so was disobedience. And if a quiet blade in the dark could preserve holy order, then perhaps the Lord would understand. Assassins learned early to watch the steeples. A chapel might be sanctuary one day, a trap the next. Some guilds had their own rules about church grounds. No blood spilled within them. Others saw no difference between killing a merchant in the street and ending a heretic in a cloister. But the smart ones tread carefully, because the church didn't forget. It held grudges across generations, in scrolls and sermons and silent vengeance. And while a noble might die and be buried, the church endured, watching, waiting, writing things down. Still, it wasn't always an enemy. Some killers took work from the cloth, quiet removals, political rebalancing, sometimes even mercy, though that was rarer. The church had a strange view of mercy. There are stories of assassins brought into the light, repenting, laying down blades, joining monastic orders, seeking redemption through prayer and silence. And there are darker stories of those same cloisters hiding killers, training them, shaping them in secret, as tools of divine will. The truth lies somewhere in between. as it always does. But if you ever walk through a medieval village and see the chapel watching over crooked streets and narrow doors, remember this. Not all prayers are for peace, and not all watchers wear armor. Punishment without trial. It didn't take much to be condemned, a whisper in the right ear, a name scratched into parchment, a look that lasted too long. In a world where shadows held secrets and power wore 1,000 masks, sometimes all it took to disappear was a suggestion, no trial, no testimony, no defense, just the decision of someone who mattered. For an assassin, that was the quiet horror behind every job. You weren't delivering justice, you were delivering conclusion, and whether the person deserved it or not, that wasn't your question to ask. Some victims were guilty of treason, of betrayal, of plots against the powerful, but others were simply inconvenient, too popular, too outspoken, too wealthy, too poor, or they had seen something they shouldn't have. And once the coin changed hands, the sentence was sealed. There were no courtrooms for most of these killings, no gavel, no law book, no procession of witnesses, only a candle-lit room where someone important gave a name. Then, perhaps, a pouch of silver, and silence. The assassin became judge, jury, and executioner, but without the luxury of time or the burden of explanation. Sometimes the condemned never even saw it coming. A drink that tasted strange, a shadow at the corner of the eye, a gentle push on a rainy stair. By the time questions rose, answers had already died. This wasn't justice, not really. It was convenience. It was fear. It was power, exercised in the quietest, most permanent way. And the worst part, no one ever admitted it. The officials would deny involvement. The clergy would offer prayers. The nobles would pretend to mourn. And in back rooms, coin would flow again. Perhaps for another name. Perhaps to erase the memory of the last one. Even the assassin learned not to ask too much. Not to wonder. Not to think too long about the widow in the square or the brother searching for answers. Because punishment without trial didn't just end a life. It erased a voice. And when you worked in the dark, you learned very quickly how easily a name could become nothing. Torture, secrets, and silence. It was never about pain alone. Pain was a means, not an end. A lever used to crack open the parts of a person that couldn't be reached with threats or steel. In the medieval world, when someone wanted the truth or claimed to want it, they often turned not to courts but to ropes, iron, and fire. For assassins, this was the great unspoken danger, not being caught, being made to speak. No oath of silence could hold forever under the right tools. Every blade in the assassin's kit had its mirror in the torturer's workshop, twisted to expose instead of eliminate, to unravel rather than end. It was a war of nerves, of endurance, of willpower, fraying at the edges of reason. Some of the instruments weren't even sharp. That was the trick, a dull wedge between joints. A winch turned a little too slowly, pain measured not by intensity, but by the patience of its application. And it wasn't just used on assassins, it was used on those who might know an assassin. A stable boy who glimpsed too much, a scribe who recognized a handwriting, a mistress who asked too many questions. The torture chamber was rarely loud. There was screaming, yes, but more often, there was waiting. The kind that stretches minutes into hours, that robs you of time, name and thought. And when secrets spilled, they didn't stop at one. Names led to faces, faces led to patrons, patrons led to entire webs of silent transactions and whispered instructions, the kind of network that only functions if no one talks. So the assassin's worst fear wasn't the gallows, it was the chair, the table, the masked man with the calm voice and the steady hands. Some prepared for it, training themselves to withstand more pain than most men could imagine. Others carried poison tucked into rings or false teeth, a last, bitter escape should they fall into the wrong hands. But not all had that choice. Some were broken, not quickly, but slowly, whisper by whisper, memory by memory, until the silence they had once lived in was replaced by a silence that came from shame, guilt, and the knowledge that they had given away everything they were supposed to protect. And the ones who gave the orders, they rarely entered the room. They didn't have to. They already knew what fear could extract, because in this world, truth was a currency, and silence was often the most expensive thing to keep. A mistake meant death, in most trades. A mistake meant doing something twice. A dented blade, a miscounted coin, an angry merchant, perhaps a lost day's pay. But for a medieval assassin, a mistake wasn't something you learned from. It was something you didn't come back from. Maybe it started with a wrong step on a damp roof. Maybe the disguise was just slightly off. Too clean for a farmer, too thin for a merchant. Maybe the guard outside the target's door didn't yawn like he always did. Or maybe the candlelight flickered too long in the wrong window, signaling nothing at all. Sometimes the mistake wasn't even yours. An informant gave a bad name. A contact vanished. A coin purse was light, and still you went in. Because waiting was risk. Hesitation got noticed, and walking away. That wasn't part of the job. Mistakes had weight. Not just because they ended your own life, but because they cracked open the whole chain. If you were caught, the questions came fast. Who paid you? Who trained you? Who else knows? You could be as silent as a stone, but even silence under pressure has its breaking point, and every mistake sent ripples outward. Names, faces, safe houses. One botched job could collapse a network built over years. So assassins learned to replay their steps constantly. Every move rehearsed in the mind. Doors checked twice, knives drawn without sound. Each job was a dance with the familiar, until one night something shifted. A face you didn't recognize, a hallway you don't remember being that long, the quiet panic under the skin. Some had backup plans, a second exit, a loyal friend waiting in the alley, but even then, chance was a cruel thing. You could spend a decade perfecting your art, and still be felled by a dog's bark, a loose stone, a child waking at the wrong time, and the punishment for a mistake was never clean. You didn't get the blade in your sleep, you were made an example, public sometimes, drawn out. The kind of death meant to send a message, not just to you but to whoever sent you. So those who survived, truly survived, didn't do so by being lucky. They did it by never slipping, never blinking, never hesitating, because in this world you didn't get a second chance, and no one mourned the man who missed his mark. When the job went wrong, it always started the same. A meeting just before dusk, a coin pouch heavier than usual, a name whispered without expression, and then the quiet preparation, oil for the blade, ash on the face, a dark cloak worn inside out. The target lived in a manor, on the edge of town. Not too grand, not too guarded. The job seemed straightforward. Too straightforward, perhaps. He'd done this before, countless times. Doors that creaked only once. Guards that looked the other way. People who would never wake again. But something was wrong this time. He felt it in his chest. A heaviness, like rain before the clouds came. He brushed it off. It wasn't his place to question feelings. Feelings got people killed. Precision saved them. And so he moved, slipping between shuttered homes through garden walls, past the kitchen where someone still stirred a pot too late into the evening. The window was open. That was the first warning. Windows were never left open. Not in a house like this. Not with gold rings on the master's fingers. Still, the job had to be done. He climbed in, slow and steady. The floorboards didn't groan beneath him. Another warning. New wood, recently replaced. Prepared, he took another step. And then, a torch flared in the hallway. Too fast, too loud, too many. It wasn't just guards. It was soldiers. Waiting, armed, alert. He'd been set up. His only advantage was time. And even that was slipping. The shadows betrayed him as the hall brightened. A voice shouted something he didn't catch. The sound of boots came thick and fast. And all he had was a blade. He moved, not toward the door, but away from it. Back through the window, down the trellis, across the courtyard. But arrows were faster than legs, and they sang above him, sharp and shrill. One caught the edge of his shoulder. He hit the cobbles harder than he meant to, rolled, kept moving, into the dark, down the well-worn path behind the baker's shop, blood trailing behind him like a whisper. He knew where to go. He'd prepared for this moment too, though he never thought it would come. A cellar beneath the butcher's, left unlocked for reasons that didn't need explaining. Inside, it was dark, cool, quiet. He sat there, heart pounding, listening, wondering. How had they known? He played every step backward in his head. The meeting, the name, the coins. It wasn't the job that went wrong. It was the hand that gave it to him. He'd been disposable from the beginning. Someone wanted him removed. And what better way to erase an assassin than to offer him the wrong target, one too well defended. A trap, dressed like any other job. He didn't sleep that night. He didn't stop bleeding. But by morning, he knew something for certain. He wasn't just a blade in the shadows anymore. He was a hunted man. And in this line of work, that meant the rules had changed. Ghosts in the tavern corner. It was a quiet tavern, the kind that didn't ask questions and didn't welcome answers. Smoke curled in the air like slow-moving thoughts. The floor was damp with spilled ale and old secrets. And in the corner, always the darkest corner, he sat, not alone, but unnoticed. The assassin had changed his cloak for a merchant's wool and tucked his blade deeper than before, one arm still wrapped in cloth from the arrow days ago. The wound throbbed, but pain had long ago become a familiar companion. Across the tavern, a dice game was growing louder. A minstrel strummed a half-tuned lute. Someone argued about the price of barley. The world spun on, unaware of the man watching it. And yet, he wasn't alone. There were others like him. You could always tell, not by the way they looked, but by the way they didn't look at anything directly. The stillness in their hands, the way they always chose the wall to their back. You couldn't train that. You earned it. In that corner, they gathered sometimes, not as friends but as ghosts. Ghosts with lungs and regrets and pouches full of quiet gold. There was the one they called Thorn, too many scars and too few teeth, still sharper than either. And Mira, she never spoke, but you always knew when she arrived. The air changed. And then the boy, too young to be there, but too old to be anywhere else. No names, no real ones, just nods, just the kind of silence that meant something. They didn't talk about work, not directly, that was dangerous, but they talked about cities burned long ago, patrons who vanished before payment, shadows that moved the wrong way on the wrong night. Each one of them had a story, and each one had learned you don't survive this trade because you're the best. You survive because you know when to disappear. That's what he was doing now, disappearing, fading into corners and becoming background noise, listening, waiting, watching. He didn't need revenge, not yet. He needed to know who had sent him into that trap, and sometimes information didn't come from messengers. It came from watching who flinched when the wrong name was mentioned, who stopped playing dice when someone said the man with the coin pouch too full. The ghosts in the tavern corner noticed everything. They never wrote anything down, never met twice in the same place. But when a whisper reached their table, passed from one hushed voice to another, he listened closely. Tonight, the whisper was this: the man who hired him hadn't just disappeared, he'd gone underground, deep underground, and he wasn't done sending knives after knives. He felt the weight of it then, not just the wound on his arm, but the truth of his position. He wasn't just avoiding death anymore, he was dancing with it, drink by drink, shadow by shadow, and the ghosts in the tavern, they were watching to see how long he could keep it up. The lonely work of killing. It wasn't the blade that was the hardest part. It wasn't the stalking, or the planning, or even the risk of being caught. It was the silence that followed. Killing, as it turned out, was a strangely quiet thing. The world didn't cheer or recoil. It didn't pause. It simply kept turning. Markets still opened. Bells still rang. Lovers still quarreled in the alleyways below candlelit windows. But for the one who'd done it, the world felt different. He didn't have a name anymore. Not really. Not one he used. The coin he carried didn't sparkle the way it used to. Not when it came soaked in memory. The work was slow, careful, meticulous. It wasn't leaping from rooftops or dueling in moonlight. Most days it was waiting. Days spent pretending to be someone else. Weeks spent tracking someone through crowded streets, memorizing their habits, learning their pace, their moods. And then, one moment, one opening, a single second in which everything would be decided, and then they were gone. No celebration, no audience, only the sound of his own breathing. He would wash the blood from his hands in cold water, or in the dew of a hillside if he had to, and then disappear again into the world. Just another face in the crowd, just another shadow at dusk, but the quiet always followed, and the loneliness. No friends, no family, no true allies, just contacts, coin, and silence. He'd learned to avoid mirrors, not because he hated what he saw, but because sometimes he didn't recognize it. The face staring back wasn't a man, it was a mask stretched tight, a mask of function, of discipline, of necessity. There were moments in those rare stolen mornings where he let himself feel something, a bird call, a child's laughter in the street below, a a warm drink in an unfamiliar tavern, but they never lasted. He knew better than to think he could ever truly come back from it. There were others like him, scattered in distant cities, leaving messages in dead drops and fading into crowds. But even they were strangers. They understood the life, but not the weight, not his weight. And so he carried it alone. Each night he lay beneath stars that didn't know his name. And each morning he rose again to walk through a world that didn't care what he had done or what it had made of him. He didn't expect peace anymore. Only the next job, the next city, the next city, the next shadow to step into. Because the truth was simple. Killing was never the hardest part. Living afterward always was. No poems for the assassin. No one sang songs about men like him. There were no ballads echoing through taverns, no verses penned in candlelight. The poets wrote of knights, of kings, of tragic lovers, never of the man who slipped through shadows, unheard and unseen, leaving only silence in his wake. And perhaps that was fitting. His life had never been one for songs. There were no noble charges, no shining armor, just mud, hunger, and the cold press of steel beneath a worn cloak. He had walked behind princes and crouched in cathedral rafters. He had seen the backs of men who thought themselves untouchable, and the faces they made when they realized they weren't. But no one wrote of those moments. He remembered once, years ago, pausing outside a tavern near the coast. Inside, a bard sang a tune about a warrior who died with honor on the battlefield. The patrons raised their mugs in cheers, roaring for the memory of a name that had been passed down through generations. The assassin stood in the doorway a moment longer, watching, listening, and then he left. He would never be in such a song. Even the people who hired him didn't know his real name. To them he was a solution, a blade, not a man. They didn't ask where he came from, or why he chose this life. They didn't wonder if he slept well, or what haunted him in the quietest hours before dawn. They simply paid and forgot. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when he let himself imagine a different path. What would have become of him, had the road forked differently? A blacksmith, perhaps. A farmer, a man with calloused hands and a family waiting by the hearth. A man who could be sung about, if not for glory, then at least for love. But the road didn't fork for people like him. It narrowed. And so he moved forward, always. He killed not for pleasure, but for purpose. He never lingered, never gloated, never sought to be remembered. The cleaner the job, the less blood, the fewer questions, the better. No grave would carry his true name. No statue would rise in his image. But perhaps that was what made him dangerous. The world feared the things it couldn't see, and no one could see him. No poems were written for the assassin, but in the spaces between the stanzas, in the unfinished verses, in the silences after songs, he was there, waiting, watching, and always forgotten. When a town knew your face, it was supposed to be a quiet job. One man, mid-40s, an innkeeper with debts and dangerous friends. He wasn't powerful, he wasn't famous, just a man who had crossed someone richer, someone louder, the kind of job no one questioned, the kind that disappeared with the smoke of the morning fire. The assassin arrived on a rain-drenched afternoon, cloaked and hooded, just another traveler among many. The town was small, more crossroads than kingdom, with streets of packed earth and doorways that all looked the same. A place where everyone knew everyone else, where news spread faster than the wind. He didn't worry at first. He had done this before. Come quietly, leave quieter. But then the butcher's wife smiled at him. Back so soon, she'd asked, wiping her hands on her apron. We didn't think you'd return after last time. He nodded, careful not to speak. His heart beat a little faster. He hadn't been here before. At least, not that he remembered. But the cooper waved at him as he passed. 2 children whispered and giggled when they saw him near the well. And at the tavern that night, the barkeep handed him a mug, without asking what he wanted. We saved the back room for you, the man said. Same as last time. He said nothing, just nodded, and took the drink. That night, sleep did not come. He lay in the dark, back against the wall, listening to every creak of wood, and every gust of wind. He thought of all the faces that had greeted him like a friend, of the stories they might have told about him, of how fragile the veil of anonymity truly was. Assassins weren't meant to be known, and yet here, in this quiet town tucked away between hills and forest, they knew his face. He'd once been told that recognition was the most dangerous thing in his line of work. You could survive a sword, outrun a bow, even escape a jail cell, but if someone knew your name, your face, your habits, There was no hiding after that. The job was done by morning. The innkeeper never made it to breakfast, but as the assassin left town, he didn't feel relief. He felt eyes on his back, not hostile, just familiar. And that somehow was worse. He vanished down the road like a shadow at dawn, but the memory of the town clung to him, a weight heavier than his blade. He had been seen, he had been remembered, and there would be no undoing that. The cloak slips eventually. It starts small, a cough at the wrong time, a loose stone underfoot, a face turned just slightly too far toward the candlelight. For a while the cloak holds, the shadows obey, the silence stretches long and wide enough to live inside. The assassin becomes smoke, mist, something between real and not. Towns blur together, names are borrowed, then discarded. The past is kept folded, locked away, spoken of by no one, but the cloak always slips. Eventually, maybe it's a mission rushed, a client too careless, a child staring just a second too long at the way you walk. Maybe it's something more mundane, a cold, an injury, hunger that makes your hands shake when they should be steady. Or maybe it's you. Maybe you begin to wonder what day it is, what town you're in, what the sky looked like yesterday. You start to recognize the look in people's eyes when they notice something they shouldn't. You feel it before they speak. You already know you're being seen. There was one time, in a city full of bells and bridges, where the assassin's hood blew back in a gust of wind. He caught it quickly, pulled it forward, but not before a stable boy caught a glimpse. The boy said nothing, just stared. But a week later, a hunter at a roadside inn asked, "You from the city then? You look like a man I saw there." Same eyes. It meant nothing, and it meant everything. He left that night without eating, without sleep. He traveled through the rain, through woods that clawed at his cloak and tore at his silence. He didn't stop until the stars turned red with dawn. He told himself it was foolish to run, but he ran anyway. Because when the cloak slips, it rarely does so loudly. There's no trumpet or alarm, just a quiet tear in the veil, and someone, a stranger, a child, a drunk, who sees what was never meant to be seen. And the assassin knows it only takes one person to remember, one word to pass, one loose thread, and the whole disguise begins to unravel. In the end, even ghosts leave footprints, and those who walk in shadows must always wonder, when will the next footstep be heard, and who will be following it? Murder across borders. Borders were made for kings, not knives. For an assassin, they were merely lines on parchment. Invisible threads meant to divide language, law, and loyalty, but not death. Death moved as it pleased, slipped through guard posts, rode hidden in carts of grain or cloaked in merchant wagons. It didn't matter whether it was the forests of Bohemia or the alleys of Florence, where gold could cross, so could murder. He never asked who drew the map, only where the blood needed to fall. Sometimes it was a prince exiled to another court, drunk on secrets and shame. Sometimes a merchant who had fled with stolen coin, thinking distance would make him safe. And sometimes it was simply a man who spoke too much, too loudly, too long. The contracts came sealed in wax, written in strange dialects, or not at all. A scrap of cloth, a token, a tooth, instructions hidden in plain sight. He had learned to read between the silences, between the borders. In France he once posed as a servant, carrying wine into halls lit with chandeliers of wax and gold. In the German states he was a tinker, bent-backed and quiet, sharpening knives for coins he never kept. In Spain, he pretended to be a monk, took confession from a man he would kill by nightfall. What bound them all together was not justice, not revenge, only coin. Coin and the careful arrangement of exits. He always counted the doors, always kept his back to a wall, always wore his blades where no one would think to look. But it was harder the farther he went, not because the work changed, but because he did. Languages blurred in his mouth. Faces faded faster. The weight of every alias wore heavier on his shoulders, and sometimes, just sometimes, he forgot who he was pretending to be. Once, near the border between Venice and the Empire, he passed a field where children were flying kites. He stopped longer than he should have. One of them waved. He did not wave back. There were nights when the stars changed above him, and he would wonder what country he was in, not because he cared, but because if he died there, he wanted to know which river might carry him home, if any would. In the end he crossed dozens of borders, some marked by rivers, some by wars, but none stopped him, and none saved him, because the true border was never between lands, it was between who he was and who he had to be, and that border was never far behind. Murder across borders. Borders were made for kings, not knives. For an assassin, they were merely lines on parchment, invisible threads meant to divide language, law, and loyalty, but not death. Death moved as it pleased, slipped through guard posts, rode hidden in carts of grain or cloaked in merchant wagons. It didn't matter whether it was the forests of Bohemia or the alleys of Florence, where gold could cross, so could murder. He never asked who drew the map, only where the blood needed to fall. Sometimes it was a prince exiled to another court, drunk on secrets and shame. Sometimes a merchant who had fled with stolen coin, thinking distance would make him safe. And sometimes it was simply a man who spoke too much, too loudly, too long. The contracts came sealed in wax, written in strange dialects, or not at all. A scrap of cloth, a token, a tooth, instructions hidden in plain sight. He had learned to read between the silences, between the borders. In France he once posed as a servant, carrying wine into halls lit with chandeliers of wax and gold. In the German states he was a tinker, bent-backed and quiet, sharpening knives for coins he never kept. In Spain, he pretended to be a monk, took confession from a man he would kill by nightfall. What bound them all together was not justice, not revenge, only coin. Coin and the careful arrangement of exits. He always counted the doors, always kept his back to a wall, always wore his blades where no one would think to look. But it was harder the farther he went, not because the work changed, but because he did. Languages blurred in his mouth. Faces faded faster, the weight of every alias wore heavier on his shoulders, and sometimes, just sometimes, he forgot who he was pretending to be. Once, near the border between Venice and the Empire, he passed a field where children were flying kites. He stopped longer than he should have. One of them waved. He did not wave back. There were nights when the stars changed above him, and he would wonder what country he was in, not because he cared, but because if he died there, he wanted to know which river might carry him home, if any would. In the end he crossed dozens of borders, some marked by rivers, some by wars, but none stopped him, and none saved him, because the true border was never between lands, it was between who he was and who he had to be, and that border was never far behind. Paid in promises, not coin. There were nights when the pouch stayed empty, not because the job failed, but because the job was different. Some contracts didn't begin with gold. They began with words, a whispered name in a tavern's back room, a letter delivered by hand, not courier, a plea, not a command. And instead of coins laid flat on a table, there were promises. Soft, heavy things, weighted with desperation. I'll feed you for a month. My brother owes me land. It's yours when I have it. She hurt my child. That's worth more than silver. He learned early on that not every death could be bought. Some had to be bartered. A roof for a winter, a safe place to sleep when the guards came knocking, a favor to be returned, someday, somewhere, or worse, loyalty. That was the trickiest currency of all. He had once ended a count's life, not for gold, but for the freedom of another man's daughter. No payment, just a father's eyes full of hope, too proud to beg, too poor to bribe. Another time, a woman came to him barefoot, hands cracked from work, and offered him her wedding ring. He didn't take it, but he did the job, because sometimes, promises felt heavier than coin. They came with memories, with expectation, with the risk of being remembered, and memory was dangerous in his trade. Still, there were moments, quiet ones, when he would pass through a village and see someone smile at him without fear. A loaf of bread left on a stoop, a door left unlatched just long enough to mean thank you. He didn't linger, couldn't, but he remembered, because in a life of blades and silence, those were the payments that echoed the longest. Not gold, not silver, but the weight of a life spared, a debt paid, a wrong quietly righted in the dark. And as he vanished down another nameless road, that was the thing he carried, not on his belt, but in his chest. A promise kept. Disguises that didn't work. He had worn many faces, a travelling friar with dusty boots and a robe too short, a chimney sweep, face smeared with ash, eyes always lowered. Once, even a drunk nobleman's cousin, weaving through torchlit halls with a false swagger and borrowed rings. But not every disguise held. There were moments, sharp, cold moments, when someone looked too long, when a voice cut through the crowd with too much certainty, when a child pointed, when a dog growled. It didn't always take a trained guard to unravel a mask. Sometimes it was a mother who remembered her son's killer. Sometimes it was a rival from another city who recognized a gait, a scar, a particular way of reaching for a blade. He remembered one winter in Rouen. The job had been simple: slip in, remove the merchant, and vanish by nightfall. He had dressed as a traveling scribe, carried real parchment, ink under his nails. A quiet, nodding man, just another shadow. But the merchant's son had once seen him. Not close, not clearly, just a glimpse, years before. Still, it was enough. The boy cried out across the marketplace. And suddenly, the quiet scribe had to run like a thief. The ink spilled, the disguise collapsed in moments. Another time, he'd worn a priest's robe in a small border town. Easy enough, he thought. Bow your head. Speak softly, avoid eye contact. But he hadn't known the local bishop was visiting. And the bishop knew every face in his flock. One wrong greeting, one failed blessing, and again, the alarm was raised. A disguise could protect, but only for a time. And if the mask slipped, if even one thread pulled loose, there was nowhere to hide but the shadows. He learned to move quickly, not just through streets and across walls, but through identities. Never wear the same face twice, never linger, never be too clever, or too quiet, or too bold. Even the best disguise was just a story waiting to fall apart, and when it did, you needed to be gone before the dust hit the ground. Because in his world, the dead had no names. But the living, they remembered. A poisoner's apprentice. He hadn't expected the old woman to be kind when he first knocked on her crooked wooden door. Sent by a man in a darker cloak than his, he was sure he'd be sent away, or worse. But instead, she waved him in, as if she'd been waiting. Her cottage smelled of rosemary, damp stone, and something else, something sharp beneath it, like crushed bitterness. She wasn't what he imagined. No hood, no bubbling pot, just a weathered woman with eyes that had seen too much and hands that moved with quiet precision. She didn't speak often, but when she did, he listened. The work was slow, tedious, measured, grinding bark into powder, weighing dried berries on a scale no bigger than a child's hand, boiling roots until the steam stung his eyes. He learned names he was told never to say aloud: wolfsbane, nightshade, monkshood, henbane, each one a whisper of death in a different voice. She taught him which poisons numbed, which stopped the heart, which mimicked illness, and which waited days before striking. There were dozens. Some worked in wine, others in warm broth. A few were best smeared along the edge of a blade, but poison, she said, was not a craft for the reckless. It was for the patient, the invisible, the ones who understood that silence could kill louder than any scream. He practiced mixing doses, using herbs that would do no more than numb the tongue or make the stomach turn. Each failure meant starting again. She was gentle but firm. When he asked how many she had killed, she only looked out the window and stirred her tea. They never used the word murder, not once. Instead, they spoke of removing danger, ending pain, or balancing the scales. He realized one day that she had likely trained many before him, and he, like them, would leave with no trace, no thanks, and no name spoken again. But he never forgot her voice. One night by the fire, when he asked if she feared being caught. "They can catch a blade," she said. "They can chase a man with a dagger, but you'll already be gone, and they'll never know which sip it was." In the months that followed, her lessons stayed with him. In inns, castles, kitchens, he looked at food differently, at cups left unattended, at the slow fading of a man who had crossed the wrong noble. Poison did not shout, it whispered. And in that silence, he had found a new kind of power, not the flash of steel, but the shadow beneath the surface, the kind of shadow no one sees coming, until it's far, far too late. Betrayed by the hand that paid, he was promised gold, not much, just enough to disappear for a while. Maybe buy a mule, a warm coat, and a new name in a town where no one asked questions. The contract had been whispered across a tavern bench, in the corner seat where the firelight didn't quite reach. The man who hired him wore gloves despite the heat, and spoke as though every word might be heard by ghosts. He didn't give his name. He didn't need to. That's how these things were done. The job was simple, or so it seemed. One target. Not noble, not famous. just someone inconvenient to someone more powerful, a merchant perhaps, or a land surveyor, who'd seen something they shouldn't have. He followed, watched, waited. The strike itself was quiet, a tilt of wine, a blade between ribs in a dark alley, one of the two. He didn't remember clearly anymore. These things blurred after a while. What mattered was the job was done, and then came the silence. No pouch of coin left where they agreed, no word from the contact, no safe house waiting just outside the city walls, just empty streets and shadows that grew longer by the hour. He waited a day, then two. By the third night, he realized he was being followed. It started with footsteps, soft, steady, always just out of view. A cough in an alley he'd already passed. The same man at the edge of the market, buying nothing, watching everything. They weren't guards, not city men. These were quiet types. Trained, he had become the loose thread in someone else's story. Perhaps the merchant had connections. Or maybe the man who'd hired him never intended to pay, just needed a tool, and now wished to dispose of it before it spoke. He moved carefully, switching inns, changing routes, even wearing a priest's robe one morning, just to avoid a checkpoint. But it didn't matter. The hand that had once paid him now pointed others in his direction. He thought, at first, that it was punishment for a mistake. But no, he had done the job. The betrayal was cold, clean, transactional. To them he was just another expendable blade. On the fifth night, he didn't sleep. He sat in the rafters of a barn outside the city, knife drawn, every muscle aching from stillness. And in that silence, he understood something bitter and permanent. It wasn't just the job that made this life hard. It was never knowing which shadow carried coin, and which carried a dagger meant for you. The assassin hunted. The hunter rarely thinks of becoming the hunted, but that's the truth. Every assassin eventually meets. A quiet truth, slow as dusk settling over a silent village. He first noticed it, not in the alleyways, but in the way doors stayed shut when he passed, in the way innkeepers no longer made eye contact, and in the subtle stillness of towns that once offered him rest. Word was spreading, not loud, not shouted from rooftops, but passed softly, from lips to ears. A warning, a description, a name, perhaps, or just a symbol. The message, someone was looking for him. He didn't know who. Not yet, but he could feel it. A rider on the road behind him, who never seemed to close the distance. A pair of boots at the edge of his vision each morning when he rose. Once, a knife left sticking in the lintel above his bed. Not meant to harm, just to remind him that the game had changed. He moved faster, slept less. He cut through forests instead of roads, circled towns instead of entering them, ate whatever he could trap or steal. His horse, once sleek, now limped on one leg. His cloak, once lined with soft fur, was stiff with weather and wear. Still, they followed. Who were they? Royal agents? Another guild? Someone seeking revenge for a face he no longer remembered? It didn't matter. What mattered was that they were good. Good enough to track a man trained not to leave a trail. He tried to leave false paths, footprints doubled back, broken branches in the wrong direction. He even spread ash in streams to cloud the scent. But they kept coming. One night, he spotted one, just a flicker in the tree line. A figure too still for a hunter, too calm for a traveler. Whoever they weren't in a hurry. They knew he was tired. Worn thin, they were waiting for him to make a mistake. That night, sleep would not come. Instead, he crouched beneath the roots of a fallen tree, blade in hand, listening to every rustle. Not for a target, but for someone coming for him. And in that hollow space of fear and memory, he realized something new. This was what his prey must have felt. The same gnawing dread, the same ticking heartbeat, the same breath caught in the throat every time a twig snapped nearby. He had become what he used to chase. And there, under the cold stars, the assassin began to understand the shape of his own shadow. Not as a weapon, but as a warning. No safe place. Not even church. By now the assassin had learned there were no places left to trust. Not forests, not roads, not even the stone-walled stillness of a church. He approached the chapel with hesitation. It was old, half forgotten, clinging to the edge of a mountain village like a ghost of better times. Ivy covered most of its sides, and the bell tower leaned as though it had grown tired of standing. But its doors were open, and the warm candlelight inside seemed almost inviting. For a moment he let himself believe. He stepped inside, careful and quiet, boots damp with the mist of morning. A monk looked up from the altar, nodded once, then returned to his prayer. That was the way it used to be. Priests didn't ask questions. They offered food, sometimes shelter, and if not peace, then at least pause. He sat in the back, as always, near the side wall, back to the stone, eyes on the door. There were no weapons allowed inside, not in any church worth its salt. He had wrapped his blade in cloth, hidden it beneath the wooden bench, still within reach, still close, but something felt off. The prayers were soft but too steady, the silence too complete. Even the candlelight seemed to flicker the same way, like breath being held. He scanned the faces. Most were old, worn, the kind who had long since traded youth for wisdom. But one man, near the front, had calluses on his knuckles and eyes that didn't blink enough. Not a villager, not a pilgrim. He was not alone. The assassin didn't move right away. He bowed his head, not to pray, but to think. If they had followed him even here, to a place of sanctuary, then it was no longer about revenge. This was a hunt, cold and deliberate, and someone had hired people who didn't mind spilling blood even in sacred places. He waited until the end of the service, watched the not-quite priest slip out through the side door, heard the soft sound of footsteps following, too close, too purposeful. The assassin rose and walked the long way around the chapel, down the back corridor, through the vestry, and then into the shadows beyond the altar. There, behind a wooden panel, he found what he had hoped for, a hidden stair, old and narrow, winding down into stone. A crypt maybe, or a passage built for monks who once feared war. He took it, and vanished into the cold earth beneath the church. Outside, the men with eyes like wolves found only empty pews and dying candlelight. No safe place, not even the house of God. What a coin couldn't buy by now. The assassin had enough coin to disappear twice over. He could have paid for silence, for passage, for a name no one knew, and a room no one asked about. The kind of wealth that in theory bought distance from the blood and the past. But coin couldn't buy quiet dreams. It couldn't buy trust in a stranger's smile, or sleep without the twitch of a hand toward a hidden knife. It couldn't purchase a single minute of the life he might have had if he'd taken another road, one where names didn't vanish and friends didn't die behind taverns. He held a silver piece in his palm one morning, just before dawn. It was warm from his hand, smoothed down from use, and marked with the faint crest of a kingdom he no longer owed anything to. Just a symbol now, a story pressed into metal. He rolled it between his fingers and wondered, not for the first time, what he might have done if he had started out with enough of these. Could he have been a merchant? A map maker? A man who tended a garden and handed coins across a stall for bread and apples? The coin wouldn't say. He'd tried, once, to give it all up, found a town where his name meant nothing, where the innkeeper smiled without suspicion, and the baker left a warm loaf at his door just for kindness. He stayed there for 17 days, long enough to hope. Then came the shadow at the edge of the well, a man pretending to draw water who stood too straight, whose boots had no mud on them. The look, the quiet nod, the question with no words, and just like that, the coin was worthless again. All the silver in his satchel couldn't buy him peace, because peace isn't sold in marketplaces. It comes from forgiveness, from safety, from someone else's love, and those things, those were never for sale. Not to someone like him. Legends versus real life. They say an assassin moves like wind through cloth, that he can slip through a palace undetected, leave a prince dead in his bed, and disappear before the wine cools. In taverns and tales he's always perfect, silent, sharp, impossible to catch, a whisper of death in the night. But that's the version people want to hear. The version safe enough to tell children when the fire's low. The truth is quieter, and much harder to remember. In real life, the assassin didn't always move like wind. Sometimes he limped from an old injury that never healed right. Sometimes he smelled like the places he slept, moldy straw, a horse stable, a kitchen floor. There were nights when his dagger hand shook because he hadn't eaten in 2 days. The myth says he had no fear, but that's not how real fear works. Real fear is crouching in the rafters above a feast table, your breath caught in your throat, wondering if the floorboard beneath you will creak. It's the moment when a child looks up and sees you. It's the sound of a spoon dropping, and every heartbeat after it. The myth says he killed with elegance, but real killing is ugly. It's slipping in blood. It's a target who fights back harder than expected. It's wounds that scream louder than you thought they would. Sometimes you don't kill the right man. Sometimes you don't kill at all. No bard sings of the assassin who failed. No tale mentions the one who couldn't finish the job because the target was too young, or too kind, or had eyes that looked like someone he once knew. The myths never tell you what it's like to sit in a church, pretending to pray while a nobleman's guards search the pews. They never describe the dull ache of hunger, the raw fingers from climbing stone walls, or the rain that ruins the powder in your pouch. People imagine the assassin alone by choice, a romantic loner, but truthfully, most were alone because they had no one left, no one to trust, no one who could know their name. Sometimes they went months without speaking to another soul. They watched families laugh through windows and wondered what it felt like to be known and loved. They watched children grow and realized time was slipping past them like a shadow they couldn't follow. There was no glory, no brotherhood, no praise, just work, and waiting, and fear. Some had a code, some didn't, some took money, some didn't ask for anything but silence and escape, but none of them were like the song said, none of them were made of myth. Because at the end of the day, every assassin was still just a person with hands that bled, a heart that beat too fast, a face they couldn't show, and memories they could never outrun. And when their time came, if it didn't come by sword or rope, it came quietly, in a barn, or a ditch, or a nameless bed far from any map. And no one came to mourn, because legends are remembered. Real assassins were meant to disappear. Not all assassins escaped. The job wasn't built for retirement. There was no peaceful ending for men who lived in the dark, no farm waiting at the edge of a quiet village, no warm fire, no grandchildren asking what you used to do. Some slipped away, yes. They vanished into misty ports, or changed names in distant towns. A lucky few became shadows so convincing that even history lost them. But most didn't, because the truth is, not all assassins escaped. Sometimes it was the wrong turn in a crowded alley, a lantern swinging too far, a name spoken in the wrong ear, a knife that didn't land where it was supposed to. Or worse, no mistake at all, just the quiet closing of a trap that had been set long ago. There were guilds and masters who paid well for silence, but they didn't like loose ends. A blade who knew too much, or who failed one too many times, was a risk that had to be handled, quietly, efficiently. Sometimes the last face an assassin saw was another assassin's. Others were caught by the people they were sent to kill. Not every nobleman slept as deeply as expected. Some wore armor to bed, some left traps in the hallway, and some, fewer, but enough, fought back with such force that even a trained killer couldn't recover. Capture didn't often end in prison, not for someone whose trade was murder. If you were lucky, they made it quick. If not, the questions began. What names did you know? Who sent you? Who paid? What else did you see? And if you couldn't or wouldn't answer, they made sure you never spoke again. Torture wasn't rare, nor was public execution. Some cities made examples of assassins, others pretended none had ever existed. But whether the ending came in chains, in fire, or in a dark pit somewhere, it came, even for the best. Because skill couldn't stop time, reflexes dulled, eyesight faded, and the world kept changing faster than anyone could hide. A disguise that worked 1 year could betray you the next. And when your name finally caught up with you, there wasn't always a door to run through. The stories never tell you about the ones who didn't escape. The man buried without a headstone, the woman left in the river, nameless, the footsteps that stopped at the edge of a cliff, with no sign of a fight, or the note left behind. Short, strange, and never fully understood. But history is full of ghosts, some loud, some quiet. And if you listen closely, in the silence between tales you can still hear the breath of those who didn't make it out. Not villains, not heroes, just people. People who once held a knife under their cloak, and hoped one day to put it down. Death by silence. There are ways to die that leave a mark. A flash of steel in a crowded square. A name whispered in fear. A chase through alleyways where footsteps echo too loud to forget. And then, there is silence. The kind of death that doesn't raise alarm. That slips in, does its work, and vanishes before anyone knows to be afraid. That kind of death was the assassin's craft, and sometimes their fate. Because silence, while a tool, could also be the end. It might begin with a missed signal, a meeting that never happened, a letter that never arrived. In this line of work, there was no safety net. If something went wrong, there was no shouting for help, no second chance, just a heavy stillness where certainty used to be. Assassins lived alone, not always in body, but always in trust. Every relationship was layered with secrets, even loyalty had its limits. And so, when something felt off, when the city seemed just a little too quiet, or a known path suddenly unfamiliar, the heart began to pound, not from guilt, but from instinct. Because silence was never just silence. It was a missing contact, a cold glance from a guildmaster, a coin purse that came light, a mark that vanished before the kill. Small things, each easily explained, but put them together, and something was coming. Something final. Sometimes, the silence came from within. There were killers who lost the will, slowly, who could no longer lift the knife, not because of fear, but because they had grown hollow. They disappeared, not from pursuit, but from weariness. Their names were never spoken again, not because they were feared, but because they had been forgotten. And then there were those who were silenced, deliberately. A job that was too sensitive, a client too powerful, a guild that couldn't afford a loose thread. One night, you walk into the wrong house, or trust the wrong man, and no one hears from you again. Not all assassins died in battle. Some died waiting, some died knowing, some died never realizing they were already marked. There is a grave somewhere outside the walls of a once proud city. It's unmarked, nothing grows there, just a patch of dry earth and a strange, cool stillness in the air. The locals say nothing about it, but they all walk a little faster when passing by, as if the quiet there isn't just peace, but a memory. Maybe someone lies beneath it. Maybe they once carried a name. Maybe they died by silence. And maybe, in the end, that's all they ever truly served. Graveyards with no names. Not all resting places have markers. Not every grave gets a prayer, and not every soul that vanishes is remembered. Out beyond the edge of town, where even the crows don't linger long, there are places people don't talk about. Overgrown fields, quiet valleys, forest hollows, no crosses, no stone, just earth, undisturbed and slightly uneasy. The kind of soil that feels too still, too watchful. This is where they buried the ones who weren't meant to be found. The assassins who failed, the spies who knew too much, the traitors to guilds or kings, or secrets wrapped so tight they couldn't survive being spoken aloud. Some were killed in silence, others disappeared in the middle of a task, never seen again. A few likely saw it coming, sensed that last job was a little too neat, a little too eager, a goodbye in disguise. And so their stories ended, not with fire or sword or fame, but with a shallow grave dug by someone who would not remember the spot, or who would try to forget it. No names, no dates, no warning to those who might walk nearby, just a hollow place in the world. It was safer that way. In cities where the assassin's trade thrived, the guilds kept their own rules, but those rules didn't include honor after death. There were no funerals, no eulogies. The most you could hope for was that someone somewhere might notice you were gone. Most didn't. Sometimes, late at night, an old caretaker might glance toward the edge of a ruined chapel wall, where grass grows a little differently, or a child exploring woods might stumble on an odd mound and feel the chill that follows, but they wouldn't understand. Just a strange place where birds don't sing, and so these places remained. Quiet, nameless, waiting. There's something haunting about a life erased so thoroughly, not just killed but removed, as if they had never been. But the world remembers in its own way, in the stillness of forgotten valleys, in the twist of tree roots above a shallow grave, in the uneasy feeling that somewhere, long ago, someone was buried here and no one came to mourn them. Graveyards with no names, fitting perhaps for those who lived without them. A family never known, somewhere out there, someone might have loved them. Maybe a mother still whispered their name when the wind moved through the trees. Maybe a sister once waited on a hill, expecting someone who never returned. Or perhaps a child grew up wondering why no one ever spoke of their father. But in the life of an assassin, family was a luxury, a danger, a weakness you could not afford to have. And so many of them never did. The lucky ones were orphans, pulled from streets and gutters, taught early that trust was a story for fools. Others had families once briefly, a home with a warm fire, a name spoken with care. Then something happened. A debt, a death, a disappearance, and the person they had been was wiped clean. The guilds that trained assassins didn't leave room for mothers and fathers. They erased the past as a rule. If a name lingered, it was taken from them. If memories clung too tightly, they were starved out. What mattered was skill, silence, and the ability to kill without hesitation. To have a family was to risk betrayal, to miss them was a liability. And yet, no matter how cold the life became, something remained. A face half remembered, a lullaby hummed under breath, a pair of old boots that reminded them of someone's kindness long ago, tiny things, tucked into corners of the mind like dried herbs, fragile, fading, but still alive. Sometimes an assassin would pause in the shadows and look through a window at a family sitting together, laughing, passing bread, living like people who didn't have blood on their hands. They would watch quietly, face unreadable, then turn away, disappearing back into the dark. No one asked questions. If a contract ever came with a name that struck too close to memory, they were expected to finish it anyway. The past was not supposed to follow you, but it did, and in the end, when they vanished, whether in battle or betrayal, or a forgotten grave, there was no one left to mourn them. No one who knew, no one who could come forward and say, "That was my brother," or "She was my daughter," because they had lived a life where family could not survive, and when they were gone, they left nothing behind but questions no one would dare to ask, a family never known, and a name never spoken again. Regret between missions. There were always quiet hours between the noise, between one name whispered in a smoky tavern, and the next blade drawn under moonlight. There was time, and in that time, however brief, regret would sometimes creep in, uninvited. It came not like a storm, but like a slow fog, a memory, a smell from a past life, a face that resembled someone once spared, or someone who wasn't. For all their cold training, all their oaths and methods, assassins were still people beneath the silence, and people remembered. They remembered the sound of their first kill, the way it stayed with them longer than they admitted. They remembered the ones who looked them in the eye before the end, and the ones who didn't even see it coming. Some kills brought coin, and nothing more. Others brought dreams that wouldn't leave. There were no priests in the shadows, no confessions, no forgiveness to seek, so when the weight of it all pressed too heavily, they spoke only to the walls, or to no one, or they drank until their thoughts blurred, or sat perfectly still, listening to the fire crackle low, trying to feel something other than what they were becoming. Regret, for an assassin, wasn't always about the dead. Sometimes it was about what might have been, a different path, a letter never sent, a child never known, a kindness they almost showed before instinct overruled it. The mission always came first, but in the pause before the next one, they wondered what had been lost along the way, and no one saw that part. The stillness, the loneliness, the quiet rooms with only a candle and a pair of boots waiting by the door. When dawn came, the mask would be worn again, the dagger checked, the name memorized, the path chosen once more. But for just a while, between missions, they remembered who they might have been, and mourned, quietly, the version of themselves they never became. The ones who walked away. Not every assassin died by the blade. Some simply disappeared. They didn't vanish in the way of myth or magic, but in the quieter sense, they slipped away between contracts. Left no message, no trail. They simply stopped answering the knock at the door, the signal by firelight, the token left on the edge of a well. At first, no one noticed. The world of hired blades was not one that paused to look backward. Those who walked away were presumed dead, imprisoned, or worse. But now and then, rumors floated through the underground, whispers in the back corners of inns, or from a half-drunk mercenary, stories of assassins who had left the life behind and lived. A man who kept bees on the edge of a ruined village, a woman who sold thread and never raised her voice, a former blade hiding under another name, raising goats somewhere too quiet for questions. The guilds and handlers considered them ghosts, traitors even. Walking away was not permitted, not really. But hunting them down, that cost more than it earned. And besides, a few who vanished were respected, or feared, enough to be left alone. And why did they walk away? It wasn't always guilt. Some had simply grown tired of running, tired of never sleeping well, of counting coins that couldn't buy peace. Others found something unexpected, a child left in their care, a person who saw through the silence, a reason to stop. They rarely spoke of their pasts, but in the hush of night, when the world was still and the dogs asleep, they sometimes looked at the stars and remembered the names they never said aloud, the ones they took, and the ones they spared. No one wrote songs about them. No books recorded what they did after they left the shadows. But somewhere out there, far from blades and poison, The ones who walked away lit fires, poured tea and tried, just a little, to become whole again. It wasn't an ending, it was a choice. Folk tales and fabrications, time does strange things to memory. It sands down the sharp edges and smooths out the facts. And when it comes to assassins, memory turns into myth. The people of the towns and villages, the ones who lit candles at dusk and locked their shutters tight, they didn't know the true stories. Not really. All they had were rumors, and rumors, once repeated enough times, become something else entirely. They told tales of assassins with eyes that glowed red in the dark, of killers who could vanish into walls, walk without sound or leap across rooftops like shadows made flesh. Some stories said they could turn invisible by breathing in incense. Others swore they could speak to crows and ask them to spy. In the marketplaces, children would play games pretending to be these faceless blades. One would creep through alleys while the others pretended to be guards, shouting and laughing. None of them knew the weight of it, the waiting, the silence, the loneliness that always came after the job was done. Stories also grew around the assassins who never existed. Entire legends were born from nothing more than a poorly understood death. A noble who fell sick in the night, clearly poisoned by a guild, the whispers said. A soldier who vanished on patrol, taken by silent blades, they claimed. The real assassins, if they heard these tales, rarely corrected them. Why would they? It was safer that way. Fear did more than any blade could. If people believed you could melt into mist or kill with a whisper, they were less likely to ask questions, less likely to come looking. Even centuries later, long after the guilds had faded and the names were forgotten, the stories clung to corners of villages and old roads. Travelers would warn each other not to linger by certain ruins where an assassin was said to have died, or they'd speak in hushed tones about a cursed knife buried under a crossroads. Most of it was nonsense, but not all of it, because sometimes in those rare moments between sleep and waking, a farmer swore he saw a figure in the trees, silent, watching, then gone. Just a story, they'd say, a fabrication, but the best lies always have a thread of truth running through them, and in the quiet places of the world, the old myths still breathe. What the records forgot, the parchment was thin, brittle in the corners, ink faded, names smeared, pages missing. That's what history leaves us when it's done with someone. Assassins were never meant to be remembered, not in the way nobles were, or knights, or kings. Their lives were designed to pass through unnoticed. When the work was done, they disappeared, and with time, so did the proof that they were ever there at all. In royal ledgers and temple scrolls, there are hints, a suspicious death, a funeral that came too quickly, a quiet reorganization of a council just days after a key figure fell ill. But there's rarely a name, never a motive, that matches the truth. Sometimes there are letters, coded, burned at the edges, stored in the bottom of a forgotten archive. The sparrow has landed, one might say. The merchant will not attend the feast. Simple, strange lines, but to those who understood them, they meant life or death. Most were destroyed, of course. After a job, fire did more erasing than any sword. Even the records that survive often lie. Some exaggerate, claiming assassins were demon-possessed, unnatural creatures raised from birth to kill without feeling. Others go the opposite way, painting them as noble vigilantes, sacrificing everything for a greater cause. The truth, it was somewhere in the middle, but it was quieter and much lonelier. And then there are those few rare notes, margins scribbled by monks, whispers etched into the backs of church ledgers or estate books. The girl with the red braid was seen again near the bishop's house. Window latch found broken, nothing taken. Sir Alric would not speak of the masked one again. Pieces, just pieces. We'll never know how many assassins lived and died without a trace. No grave, no name, no story passed down. But in the spaces between official history, in the gaps and the shadows, they're there, not in ink, but in silence. Why the knife grew heavy. There was a time when the knife felt light, when the task was clear. A name, a shadowed alley, and the silence that followed. It was all work, then, precise, distant, clean enough if you didn't think too hard. Just a coin, a command, and the path out. But years passed, and with them, something began to change. It wasn't the blade itself, though it dulled like any tool. It was the weight in the wrist. The moment before the strike, the stillness before the silence. Because no matter how trained, how hidden, how practiced. They were still people, and people carry what they do. Maybe it was the boy in the market square, who smiled with the same eyes as someone once left behind, or the way the last words of a target echoed just a little too long, or the loneliness between jobs, when no one called your name, not because they forgot, but because they never knew it to begin with. The knife began to grow heavier, not in steel, but in memory. You see, no assassin stayed untouched. They learned to walk without sound, but their thoughts grew louder. They wore disguises, but their minds remembered every face. They were ghosts to the world, but their ghosts never left them. Sometimes they dreamed of simpler lives, a quiet forge, a farm with stubborn soil, a home where a door could be opened without checking the corners first. But those were dreams, the kind you didn't speak aloud, because in the end they still walked where others wouldn't. Not because they loved killing, but because they'd forgotten how to stop, and every time the knife was drawn, it shook just a little more, not from fear, but from the weight of all the lives it had already taken. The lonely end of a blade's life. It doesn't end with glory. There's no crowd waiting, no medals, no whispered legends told by firelight that ever get it quite right. Just a slow fading, quiet as dusk falling on an empty road. Most assassins didn't retire. They simply stopped being called, or vanished into places where names no longer mattered. Some found peace. A few maybe faded into the countryside with coin enough to buy a little land where no one asked questions, and the nights were mercifully still. They'd rise early, tend goats or soil, and never once look back toward the cities they once knew by rooftops and shadows. But most simply disappeared. Sometimes they were caught, sometimes they crossed the wrong noble, or the hand that paid them one day pulled the noose tighter, and sometimes, more often than stories would admit, they simply laid the blade down one night, sat in the dark with the weight of all they had done, and let silence take them. There was no brotherhood at the end, no final salute from fellow ghosts, just stillness, a blade, left beside a bed of straw, a name, never written down, a grave, if there was one, marked only by the earth's memory. They'd once been feared, moving shadows, silent storms in alleys and palaces, but at the end, they were only human, tired, alone, forgotten not by history, but by the world they helped shape in blood. And maybe that was always their fate. Not heroes, not villains, just necessary, until they weren't. The knife that had taken so many lives never asked for one in return, but it always took one. In the end, that's all a blade knows.